Knowing what the future holds can make a big difference. And that's because if we know what the future holds, then we can act and plan accordingly. A great example of this, the kind of handful of people who back in 2007 were able to predict the global financial crisis. One of these guys, John Paulson, managed to see the issues with the housing loans and brought insurance for all his property assets before they crashed. Because he knew what was coming, and because he had a sense of what the future held, he was able to act and plan accordingly. And this guy, John Paulson, cashed in big time. He personally made $4 billion. Knowing what the future holds can make a big difference. But the issue is that life is so rarely like that, isn't it? Instead of knowing the future, more often than not, we have absolutely no idea of what's to come. And often that leaves us feeling anxious and vulnerable and uncertain. And rightly so. We know so little of what the future holds. It's this truth that the teacher dwells on in these final chapters of Ecclesiastes. In life under the sun, we have no idea what the future holds for us. All of these verses from 9 verse 1 to 11 verse 6 touch on this theme. But in our talk, we're just going to focus on 4 sections in which the teacher laments on how little of life under the sun we can know. In the first section, chapter 9, verses 1 to 12, the teacher grieves the fact that we don't know when we'll die. In verse 1, the teacher acknowledges that our lives are in God's hands. God's in control. God knows, but we don't. We do know that we will die because we all share a common destiny. The good, the bad, the clean, the unclean will all die. But we don't know when. So in verses 4 to 6, we can have hope while we live. And in verses 7 to 10, we can make the most of enjoying our lives. But still, we will die and we won't know when. And the examples in verse 11 remind us that life and death are not mechanical. It's not necessarily a matter of growing old and then dying. We are all subject to time and chance. And so the teacher says, no one knows when their hour will come. Like fish in the ocean who are suddenly caught in a net, or like birds who are all of a sudden trapped in a snare, our death can come suddenly and unexpectedly. Our reflecting on death is very humbling, isn't it? And it can help us in many ways. We can, with the psalmist, number our days and remember that we won't live forever. And we can take the teacher's advice and make the most of life while we're still living. But at its core, our death is a frightening truth. We have no idea what the future holds. And the teacher reminds us we have no idea when we will die. In the second section that we'll look at, chapter 9, verse 13 to 10, verse 3, the teacher mourns the fact that we can't know whether good will prevail. He shares with us a story that has greatly impressed him. A great and powerful king has come against a small city and surrounded it with huge siege works, ramps, battlements, everything. And somehow, in some way, a poor but wise man was able to save this city by his wisdom. Maybe he pulled off some kind of trick. Maybe he brokered some kind of deal. We're not told. but he saves this city. But what impresses the teacher about this story is not that the wise man saves the city, but that the wise man is immediately forgotten. Wisdom is better than strength, the teacher says, but the poor man's words were despised and then forgotten. And in each of the following proverbs, the teacher reminds us how easily good can be undone by foolishness. He says that wise words are quiet, but fools shout. One sinner destroys much good. A little folly outweighs wisdom. There is good in the world, the teacher says, but it's so easily undone by evil. And so when we turn to the future, we can never be sure that good will prevail. In the third section that we'll look at, the teacher builds on this growing sense of helplessness about what the future holds. In chapter 10, verses 8 and 9, the teacher reflects on the fact that we can't know when accidents will come. He lists 4 kind of odd examples. If we dig a pit, we can't be sure that we won't fall into it. If we break a wall, we can't be sure that there won't be something dangerous inside to harm us. If we quarry some stone, it might fall and crush us. And if you're splitting logs, you don't know if you'll accidentally lose a toe or a foot. Accidents are always around the corner, and we don't know when they'll come. Now, we don't usually think this way, do we? And it's probably quite crippling if we always thought about every potential accident. But what the teacher's saying is true. In everything that we do, there's potential for things to go wrong. And again, we can never know what is going to happen in the future. In the fourth and final section we'll consider, in chapter 11, verses 1 to 6, the teacher offers some practical suggestions about living with the uncertainties of the future. In verses 1 and 2, he says, spread your assets. Don't sell everything locally and immediately. Send some away for long-term profit. And invest in multiple ventures because you don't know which ones will fail. The teacher hedges his bets when it comes to the unknowns of the future. In verse 3, the teacher observes that some things, like rain, seem dependable, whereas other things, like the direction a tree might fall, seem random. But in verse 4, he warns us not to rely on these things, even the things that seem dependable. He says that if you're always looking at the clouds and the wind, waiting for rain, then you'll never get anything done. And in verses 5 and 6, the teacher really summarizes the best advice he's got. In verse 5, he reminds us that we cannot understand the work of God, the maker of all things. Again, God knows how things work. God knows what will happen, but we don't. And in verse 6, he says, work one job in the morning, work another job in the evening, since you've got no idea what's going to succeed. Now, in all of these verses, there's a kind of practical wisdom to be gained. Number your days. Be careful. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. But more than that, if we're honest, there's an overwhelming sense of our helplessness in the face of all that the future holds. We like to think that life is as simple as John Paulson in the GFC makes it seem. If you know the right things and you make the right choices, then you'll succeed. But the teacher reminds us that life is not like that. We have no idea what the future holds and we can't prepare for it. And so wise or unwise, we're left feeling uncertain and fearful and anxious. And I think this is really the nail in the coffin for the teacher's search for meaning under the sun. Even if you did have all that you needed to live a meaningful life, you can never know what the future holds. And you can never know when it will all be taken away. And surely that spoils any true and lasting meaning that we could find in life under the sun. And so to finish our talk, we have to ask, don't we? How are we meant to face the uncertainties of the future? What are we to do when we face this anxiety or fear or worry about all that we can't know? Well, in the uncertainties of life under the sun, we need to turn to Jesus. We can never know what the future will hold. That's just a fact. But through faith in Jesus, we can come to know the one who holds the future in his hands. And more than that, we can come to know him not just as a maker who controls all things, but as a father who cares for us and works all things for our good. As the teacher shows us, the future is a mystery. Our time of death, whether good will be done, whether accidents will come upon us. But through faith in Jesus, we can endure that with trust instead of fear, knowing that all of our future comes from the hand of a heavenly Father who loves and cares for us.